Well, Alan Jacobs, it's been such a joy to have you here this week, 20 years after you taught me in English at Wheaton College and led a trip I went to in Oxford. So it's been great to renew friendship, but particularly good to have you here for a faculty integration seminar talking about technology and Christian faithfulness. One of the things that I've been most struck by is all of the things that we don't think of as technology that are technology. And so we could use a working definition of a technology as really anything that allows us to get something done. And you've talked, today in particular, we talked about books as technology. Could I just ask you, what's a book?
You can ask me, but
Will you tell me what's a book?
Well, the answer to that question is nobody knows, right? I mean, it is one of the most, of all the technologies that human beings use. There's probably none that there is more confusion about. I mean, everybody knows what a plow is. Everybody knows what a hammer is. I mean, those are easy to define. But a book turns out to be something that's really, really difficult to define. We know this, that it's some sort of receptacle for the written word. But not everything that is written word is a book. So a letter isn't a book. It's got to get to a certain length before it's a book.
Okay.
We're not quite sure where that is,
Because there's a booklet, which is, it's
that's
a little
right.
book.
A booklet is smaller, and I sometimes think of Randall Jarrell's definition of a novel. He says, a novel is a prose narrative of some length that has something wrong with it, which I always thought was a great definition. Yes. But with books, we look at these ancient, words. We look at biblos and the Greek words, and then the various Latin versions that tend to be associated with the word liber, and it's not quite clear what all of these refer to. So, for instance, we find ancient Romans making they're basically the ancestors to iPhones, in the sense that there are these little notebooks that people would keep around with a stylus. They'd hide it in their toga, and then they would pull it out to say, well, yes, I can meet you a week from Tuesday, and it was actually sort of a status symbol, right? And so it's a little, it's parchment leaves bound together, and then you stick a stylus in there. Not very different from just having a little paper notebook, and though not that many people could afford to have them, so they were kind of expensive. But they called those books.
And was it a book before it was written in?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was a book before it was written in. Okay. So it becomes an object that either contains or may contain text, that at some point contains text, and that has it has a beginning and an ending. It's bound together in some way, and but that's general, but it's not absolutely certain. When Job says, "Oh, that my words were written in a book," what is he thinking of? Right? Because it's not clear that they had those little bound volumes at the time. Does he mean a scroll? Well, there's also a Hebrew word for scroll. So when Job says that, we don't know whether he's thinking about a particular technology or whether he just means something like, I wish that there were some permanent record of what has happened to me, right? And so book, it turns out, is one of the most difficult to get a handle on concepts in the whole world.
Well, even handle has to be metaphorical there, because, and when you were talking about things that are bound up, that too becomes metaphorical, because I think you want to argue that ebooks are books.
I think so.
You think so? Okay.
I think so. But
why might they be and why might they not be?
Well, I think here's the thing, right? Would we call them books if we didn't already have codexes, right? Or codices, depending on whether you want to do it the fancy way or not, right? So I can go, you've got Augustine's Confessions here, right? And I've got one of these, but I've also got this book in digital form, and it's on my Kindle. Right, but it's on there with about 700 other books. Right. So what is this thing? Is the Kindle itself? Do you think of it as like one great big book?
Yeah, because you're not handling the Confessions when you pick up your Kindle.
Right. When I pick up the Kindle, I'm not picking up the Confessions, and in fact, I it's not until I actually go through the series of taps or whatever that will actually bring the text of the Confessions up, that I would say, oh, what book are you reading right now? I'm reading the Confessions,
Right.
But then in like 2 seconds later, I can say, well, now I'm reading a John Grisham novel, right? And so our notion of book in relation to Kindle or any other kind of electronic reading is kind of derivative. It's borrowed from this, right? I remember writing a short piece a few years ago for a magazine that's published in Brooklyn called Cabinet. And they do a lot of cool stuff, I think. It's kind of an artsy magazine. And had some correspondence with the editor, Sina Najafi. And one of the things I found out is that there was a little awkward dealing with him, is that he refers to every written thing as a text. He says, I really liked your text. Or he says, I was reading this text. And I thought, that's a really odd thing to do. What he's done is just kind of given up on a whole bunch of distinctions, right? Well, there's books, there are essays, there are articles, there are stories. And he's like, Sina's like, nah, it's just, those are texts.
Yeah. And what a strange thing that we call these little digital messages that come in our phones
text.
I mean, that's about the least helpful thing we could use if it hadn't become so normative. Yeah.
That's exactly right, And now, and of course, only recently with us, it's a verb now, right? Yeah. Text me. Yeah. Can you text me her number? That sort of thing. In some ways, that solves a lot of problems. You don't have to make these kind of, well, is that a book or is that not a book? Is that, wow, it's just a text. Yeah. Whatever it is, it's a text, which is true, but it's sort of the least useful word imaginable, I think. Well, why do we do that? I think we do that because, or why does Sina Najafi do that? I think he does it because we've just gotten into such ambiguous territory of not really knowing. I think what happened is that there was a long period in the ancient world where it wasn't really clear exactly what a book is, and then that sense gradually started to solidify, right? And so by the time you get into the Middle Ages, you know what a book is. This Chaucer has a book, right? And Chaucer writes the Book of the Duchess, and the book goes into, here it is. Now, even then it was a little ambiguous because you can have a poem that's in 12 books, like Paradise Lost. That's confusing. And then, so when you put those 12 books together, what are they in? Well, we call that a volume, right? And so then you can have you could have a poem in 12 books that was divided into 2 volumes that had 6 books each,
Right.
I mean, so it's never quite fixed. It remains fluid, but it gets closer and closer to being fixed. If I look at that, and I say, hey, would you hand me that book? You're probably going to hand me this. Now, in another sense, that's a book too, right?
It's an largely empty journal.
Yeah, but that's what you're more likely to say. That's a notebook, that's a journal, something like that. But that's just a plain old book. If there were a magazine on here, if there were 3 or 4 magazines plus this, and I'd say, hey, would you hand me that book? You would hand me the book. You wouldn't hand me any of the magazines, even though functionally they're the same thing.
I wonder if we had the exact same thing, one of which was printed and the other which was handwritten.
Yeah.
I bet I'd give you the printed one.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. It's an intuitive.
Yeah, no, I think so. But that's because that's the norm, and something handwritten is now perceived as not the norm anymore. Yeah. So we went through this period where it wasn't really clear what a book was. It was confusing. When Job cries out, we don't know exactly what he means. It gradually solidifies, never gets completely fixed because there are those book and volume distinctions and stuff like that. But in general, we get to the point where, okay, that's a book. And then when we get into the digital era, it starts getting confusing again. And so we're kind of back to the point where we don't know what a book is anymore. It's that environment that leads Sina to say, I like your text, And he says, I like your text. He might mean the essay that I wrote for him, or he might be a book. It might be what I think of as a book of mine that I wrote a while back.
Or it could be the emojis you included in your digital message.
Could be the awesome emojis that I include, So, the book of emoji. That would be a good. I like that. Yeah, so you've actually asked, the most difficult question you could possibly ask me. So thanks a lot, man.
Well, it'll get easier.
Okay.